Mm. Oh, right. If I remember right, this is kind of where we left off talking about last Saturday, is we went over a basic helping model where what I encourage you to start to do is do full exploration. In the exploration phase, you don't try to provide advice. You don't try to provide feedback. What you're doing is you're listening as the helper. And then through that listening process, we encourage exploration into insight to whatever the problem is. And then the action is what we're going to do to resolve the problem. If you think about it from a very clinical perspective, if we were to look at this from a clinical perspective, exploration would be the social psychological assessment. Insight would be the diagnosis, and action would be the treatment plan, if we kind of want to think about it that way. Okay. And then we talked about centered focus theory, um, and how we use this in order to develop the client therapist relationship. Because as we kind of explored, if there's not an authentic relationship between the helper and the individual, then that can create a lot of the problems we see in a lot of treatments, such as um, 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 uh, the defense mechanisms we talked about earlier, not having a truthful and honest conversation with our clients, and all the denial, for example, when we talked about addicts. Okay, so this is one way to buffer all of those things that we often experience when trying to provide treatment and help to individuals. Okay. And this is where we're going to begin because, as we mentioned, that uh, we need to build an authentic relationship with our clients, and that begins with attending and listening. Okay. And just to tell you how often, how do I put this? A lot of individuals that go into the helping field tend to feel like they are good at attending and listening. And that's why you go into this field. And that's a great motivation to have. Okay. But I will tell you, in a lot of really serious masters of counseling programs, most individuals don't succeed in those master's programs because they don't master attending and listening. They end up felling out of their master's program because they can't get these two basic skills, even though again they go into it thinking that the reason why they are such good helpers is because they listen really well. So I really would encourage you to really look at your any biases you may have. If you're one of those who think, yes, this is going to be easy for me, and but really take it seriously. Okay. I'm not sure if I'm being clear with this. Even with me, when I first started doing helping and whatnot, uh, honestly, it took me a year or two, even in practice, to really get good at attending and listening because I would find my mind wandering, or I would find myself trying to answer or solve their problem before they were even done talking, and all of those things that we shouldn't do when we're truly trying to attend and listen to somebody. Okay. But let's first talk about attending. Attending, if we want to give it a basic definition, is orienting one physically towards the client. Okay. Um, and this is what creates the physical relationship between you and your client. Okay. And it also is a good opportunity to help establish healthy boundaries. Okay. In a lot of the populations that we work with in this field, except especially in the group setting, boundaries tend to be something that clients often don't come in with in a healthy way. Okay, and one way that you can help with establishing these is through the physical relationship and the boundaries you establish with those. Okay, and with that, there is an acronym that we can use when we're talking about attending and physically orienting ourselves. And the acronym is encourages. Okay. And we're going to go through each one of these, but we're also going to make sure that we stop at each to talk about the C of all of these. And you'll notice in our encourages acronym, cultural differences and making sure we pay attention to cultural differences is important, okay? Because in each one of these, there may be a cultural aspect to consider. And the first one, of course, is eye contact, okay? Eye contact is something that in most classical counseling type of situations, therapists are told you should make sure that you have continuous eye contact with your client. Okay. And interestingly, when doing supervision, a lot of novice counselors get so worried about not having enough eye contact, they force it. And so they follow the client may turn their head to the left and they'll orient their body to make sure that they're still having eye contact with them. It's kind of an interesting thing to observe when you're watching another therapist. Okay. But I want to state what is really meant by eye contact. Okay. Is eye contact awesome. Okay. Eye contact is having that, even if it's just a few seconds of connection with another person through visual contact. Okay. In some cultures, a steady eye contact is encouraged, and it's something that is culturally appropriate. And this is an area where if a therapist comes from a culture that eye contact is not encouraged, this is something that the therapist should practice with, especially if they're working with diverse populations where eye contact is a sign of respect. Okay. There are other cultures where eye contact is not appropriate. Maintaining eye contact, I should say, is not appropriate. And so it's not always a good idea to try and force the eye contact. Okay. And this for people who come from cultures where when you're having a conversation with them, you look them in the eyes and everything else. This is something that can be difficult, again, if you're working with diverse populations where eye contact may not be appropriate for that individual. Okay. Um, so with this, how do we make sure that we're at least having that millisecond with someone with visual contact through our eyes, because the eyes are the window to the mind, if we want to put it that way? How do we make sure that we're not being offensive to those who eye contact is not really appropriate, but also making comfort for those who are? Okay. There is a method until you really kind of get to know your client that you can use. Okay. If you put your finger between your eyes on your nose and you go one thumb length up, you should be kind of at the um, middle, kind of above the ridge of your brow. Okay. If you look there, instead of making complete eye contact, For those who are uncomfortable with eye contact, they recognize that you're not doing that. For those who do like eye contact, their perceptions become that you are doing it. Okay. And so that is a good way to gauge where a client is at, is by, instead of trying to force eye contact or avoid eye contact, look at that place about a thumb above your eyebrow. Okay. And that's a good way, then you can start to gauge, okay, this individual it's not appropriate for that and whatnot. Okay. And this does come up. As I mentioned, I early in my career, I worked with victims of domestic violence and whatnot. And I remember working with a few Asian women who, in that culture, it's not appropriate for the woman to maintain eye contact with the man, but they can maintain eye contact with the women, with other women. Okay. And so in the beginning of my career, I always thought it was strange that they would go into my female colleague's office and they would have this visual contact with each other, but then they would come to my office and they'd look at the floor. All right. And it took me a while to realize that that's a cultural thing. It's not because they didn't like me. Okay. And it's important to recognize those differences, and that it's not about you, it's about a culture, it's about things that they experience. Okay. So kind of keep that in mind. Think about if you're working within your local communities, within your Native American nation and not whatnot, uh, practice what you know about your own culture when it comes to this. Okay. The second one, which is nods, is just acknowledgement that you are listening. Okay. So a nod isn't just like, oh, okay, rolling your eyes. A nod is an intense feeling that you're interested. So the nod, your head should approach the client slightly and then come back so that they see that you're engaging with them. All right. And this should occur every once in a while when the client finishes a statement or something, where you just physically, approachingly nod gently so that they can see that physically and psychologically you're there. Okay. Cultural differences, we're getting to all of these as we are um, noting these again. The fourth one is open stance. All right. So, how do I put this? I don't mean like inappropriate macho open stance. You have your legs spread wide apart and you're leaning over your chair and just kind of hanging. What's meant by open stance is that your physical body is oriented towards your client. Okay. Because when we start to close our body, it actually sends a signal that you are uncomfortable with what is being said, that you are being, in a sense, traumatized by what is going on. All right. Again, when talking about open stance, one of my bad habits when I first started helping people is I would fold my arms. And I thought I was folding my arms because it's comfortable to fold my arms, but I realized that I folded my arms whenever my clients started saying things that I was uncomfortable with. Okay. And so, yes, I will be honest with you. What my uh, supervisor had me do for like the next 12 sessions that I did is I actually had to sit on my hands and resist folding my arms, because that's not open. It's not open to your client. Okay. And an open stance is also a stance of trust, and it signals trust to your client. Okay. The U And we're going to spend a lot of time on check for understanding. Um, when we get to facilitation skills, okay? But I do want you to start practicing this, okay? Is when someone says something to you, repeat back to them what they said, but start with, so what I heard you said, and correct me if I'm wrong, X, Y, Z, okay? In the first I think we've already talked about this in the class. In the beginning part of this, your friends and family are going to go, oh, she's doing that counseling thing with me again, or that social work thing with me again. But the more and more you do it, the more and more natural it sounds. Okay. So I would encourage you to start practicing this with your friends and your family so it becomes just a natural thing where you just kind of say, hey, this is what I heard you say. Am I wrong on this? XYZ, eye contact, nods, cultural differences, and open stance. Okay. So practice that. What that does for the client is not only are they thinking, oh, they're listening to me, which we're going to get to listening here in just a moment, but they are engaged with me, and this is the attending part. They're not just sitting there passively listening, okay? And that is the check for understanding, okay? The next one is relax. Um, uh, Take a breather. If you're one of those who are highly anxious individuals, if you're easily stressed, I would encourage you to practice relaxation techniques, making sure that you loosen up your muscles and just be there in a relaxed thing. This is especially important when we're dealing with individuals who come from chaotic crisis types of life, is that they're used to a highly stressed environment, okay? And what we want to create is an environment where they don't feel they need to be hyper vigilant, non-trusting. We want to create an environment where we can lower those physiological um, uh, uh, activities so that they have a clear access to their thought processes, their feelings, and their emotions. Okay. Avoid distracting behaviors. All right. Um, I, I giggle at this because I know a lot of social work colleagues love having all the things on their desk and the cute little figurines and all this. And I am stereotyping a little. I really am, and I know that, but bear with me in this example. And all the post-its everywhere and all of this. I would encourage you to go through and put those things in a box. Okay. Um, because the environment in and of itself can be a huge distraction for your clients. Okay. And so for example, when we look at a group room, we should make sure that group room doesn't have all these distracting items everywhere. It's clean, and it's appropriate. Okay. Um, on this, we want to avoid distracting behaviors. Okay. So I actually did this in the class the other day while I was lecturing. I had a pin and I was doing this throughout the whole class, clicking on my desk. I didn't realize it was annoying my students. But I learned my lesson because after the class, I picked up the pen and it blew up in my hand and I had ink everywhere. My point being is if you are one of those who tend to be a fidgeter, you need to have a pen in your hand when you talk, you do a lot of hand gesturing. This is the time to practice calming those things down. Again, my thing, what has always been holding a pin while I'm talking. Again, when I started counseling, again, my supervisor said, I'm taking all the pins out of your office whenever you're seeing a client, because she quickly recognized that that was one of my distracting behaviors. So think about the fidgeting, all of those. If you're one of those who have that leg thing, where your leg is constantly moving, practice pushing your hand on your leg for the first little while to keep your leg from doing that. Um, and practice those things. Okay. The next thing that shows good attending is grammatical style. Okay. Grammatical style, it used to be a long time ago when counselors were really looking at, should we match our client's grammatical style, or should we use our professional way of communication? Okay, and they took it to the extreme. They in years ago, counselors were to train to talk like your client. Okay. Um, we've kind of backed off of that, but what we haven't backed off on is matching where they are grammatically. Okay. If they tend to use small words, if they tend to use simple words, don't make this a judgment call, but we should use smaller words and simpler words. Okay. We should really practice not using our professional jargon. Okay. And so, not using words like, well, according to this theory, you're going through an existential crisis where your ego is blah, blah, blah. No, try to stay away from professional jargon, academic jargon. Um, and because that, again, when we start to use those languages, okay, the client can then start to think that they're in an authoritarian situation where you're an authority figure and they are just there to listen to you. Okay. And again, if you think about that situation with a lot of individuals we work with, that's going to close them off. Okay. They're not going to want to talk about really the difficult things in life because they're afraid that they might get in trouble. Okay. So you want to be careful with that and match their use of language with your use. That doesn't mean you have to, if it's someone who swears a lot, it doesn't mean you have to swear, but making sure you use the language that they use to communicate. Okay. The E is for ears, and this one, kind of like with check for understanding, is that you are truly showing that you're listening. Okay, that you're not putting your hand on your ears, you're not doing things that look like you're not listening to the client. Okay, so ears is really about showing that you are listening. And then the last one is S for space appropriately. Okay, when I used to do individual counseling, I set up my office so that the client had options to decide where they wanted to sit. So there was a place for them to sit that was the furthest away from me, but there was open space between us. There was a place to sit where we were at about a 36-degree angle from each other, or we were close right next to each other, or they had the option to sit at my desk where there is a physical object between us. Okay. And what I used to do is I used to not enter my office until the client uh, chose a place to sit. And what I would do is I would open the door for them and say, okay, sit wherever you like, wherever you're comfortable, and they will navigate their space and get to where they are comfortable in that situation. Okay. Now, with that being said, let's say we had the client who chose to sit at the desk, so their physical barrier is there. One of the goals that through attending that I established when that occurred, and it was perfectly fine. Again, I worked with victims of domestic violence. Sometimes having a male helper was very intimidating. So having that desk was a usual place to begin with. Okay. But the goal is, and how I knew that our relationship was developing is eventually the client would go in and sit in an open distance. And then my goal was to at least get to the point where they were comfortable enough to where we were sitting with each other at about a 45 or 36-degree angle. Okay. Because that really it shows a lot of progress in the relationship you have with your clients. Okay. Um, so think about that. In the group setting, what I usually used to do in the first few groups is I would have the chairs folded up and I would make sure that the environment was clean and there were no distractions. And I would go into the space with my group members and I would say, okay, gang, let's do a circle. We'd get chairs and do a circle, and I would let them be controlled over how big or how small that circle would be, how much distance they'd be put between each other and everything else for the first few times that we were together, because I wanted to make sure that they felt they were in a safe, comfortable space and they were choosing how they wanted to be there. Okay. And so think about that when you're starting up a group and with group facilitation about how are you going to make sure that the client feels good in that space through but making sure everyone is spaced appropriately. Okay. So these are some of the kind of things to think about when thinking about attending. And so with this, after encourages, so we practice all of these things. Then we also need to practice the next skill, which is listening. Okay. Listening is capturing and understanding the message as the client experienced it. Okay. And this tends to be one of the difficult parts about listening is that we tend to listen and fill in information with our own experiences, perceptions, and bias and stereotypes. Okay. And so this is something I would encourage you to do, and we will explore these, is I would encourage you to be completely honest with yourself about your own biases and your own perceptions and your own stereotypes about individuals, and be honest with yourself. And before you walk into a counseling room, a group space, try this imaginary trick that you're basically imagine yourself pulling your biases out of your head with your hand, do it physically, and set them by the outside door of the counseling room and and just kind of tell yourself, I'm leaving you here for now, and go into your space with a clear and hopefully unbiased mind. That kind of ritualization to remind yourself of your own human really frailties. Okay. And I'll give you an example of one of the human biases and stereotypes I had when again talking about working in the field of domestic violence and sexual assault. Probably 98, 99% of the survivors that I worked with were female, and the majority of the abusers were male. Okay. Now, this doesn't say that there can't be female offenders and male victims, but this is just the reality of providing services. Okay. And so when I did have a male come into my office, I had huge biases and stereotypes that really interfered with me being an effective helper with that male survivor, because I could not get over my stereotype and human bias that they are an offender because they were in a domestic violence situation. So a male survivor would come into my space, and I would all of a sudden start building the story in my head where it's going to come out that they're the actual offender and it's probably their spouse who is the victim. And I would try to find that evidence to then try to refer them to the offender group or to the men's group, which tended to be anger management or something like that. Okay. That was huge for me. And when I came to realize it, is when I one of the male survivors went and worked with one of my female colleagues while I was I think on vacation or away for some time, and I came back, and my colleague really sat me down and said, "I think you're messing this up." And you're going down the wrong road with this individual. They're really hurt and they're in pain and they don't know what to do. And they feel like you're accusing them constantly that they're the offender. Okay. Again, that was, for me, that was a huge wake up call. Okay. What I want to encourage you to do is know your biases, know your prejudices, know your stereotypes. We all have them, and start to work through them now so that you don't end up hurting someone in the end. Okay. I was fortunate because I had a colleague who who interfered and saw it and said, okay, we got to stop this. But I will tell you as a supervisor, sometimes there's not that person that was there to stop that bias from occurring, and it can lead to harm to individuals who deserve better. Okay. So listening really is, again, going back, setting aside our biases and truly listening to the client's story as the client understands it. And it goes back to this idea that we are not, unless you're a forensic interviewer and you're doing it for the police department, we are not investigators. We are helpers, and we got to help people from their perception and their reality. And yes, through the treatment process, will we challenge some of these things, and will we challenge what are called quote unquote bad thought processes? Yes, we will, but we can't do that until we really understand our clients' lived, real experience as they see it. Okay. All right. So again, unbiased listening means re responding before knowing. Okay, so one of the things I do want you to practice is when you're listening to someone and you start to build a theory or a response or a solution to their problem, stop yourself, clear your mind, do some, what is that called? Mindfulness, where You bring yourself back centered to where you're at. Sometimes it may be telling your client to hold on for just a second. You can say interrupt and just say, hey, give me just a second. My mind, I got to come back to us, and then ask them, okay, continue once you've brought yourself back to where you should be. So I really would encourage you to practice that and really work with it. And I know that if you work in a high volume situation, I know social workers who can see anywhere from 10 to 15 people a day, and that's a lot. And you really need to get them in and out of your office. And I've heard this before that whole listening thing is just going to take too much time. But I will tell you that even in those high volume situations, if you truly listen, one, mistakes that you'll make will greatly reduce, and you will also not have to relive or revisit stuff when we're wrong. Okay, so it actually is a time saver, and not something that just is nice to have, as I would say. And the other part of listening is making sure that you effectively reflection of your client's thoughts and emotions. Okay. Um, and so not only do we want to say things like, so what I heard you say today, or what I heard you, what I understand you're trying to say, that unbiased listening means that I don't respond before knowing. Okay. But I also noticed when you were talking about unbiased listening that you kind of had an emotional response. Can you tell me more about how you were feeling when you were telling me about that? So, not only should we effectively reflect on thoughts that are being told to us, but we also need to take the time to understand their emotional state as they're telling certain parts of their story. And this includes working with difficult people. Okay. We'll talk about certain types of individuals who don't belong in group therapies, such as psychopaths, such as psychopaths. Okay. And we'll talk about identifying those individuals because they tend to make your group worse, not better, according to all the research. But being able to effectively understand thoughts and emotions is really the only way to understand whether the individual is being authentic or artificial, which is what most psychopaths and narcissists tend to be. Okay, so picking up on those issues also is a group management therapy management tool as well. Okay. Okay. So I am going to stop sharing. I'm going to stop the YouTube, and before